Hello, everybody. Oh, I see a lot of Canadians in the audience, actually. I wonder. The rest will start coming in once they realize we're talking about Canada, the beacon of, well, there's a lot going on. Let's just say that. So my name's Katie Sullivan. I am with IETA, International Emissions Trading Association. Have been a long-time supporter and partner with CAR for this conference. And also, I am Canadian. And with IETA, we represent businesses all over the world, all types of businesses, all around informing carbon pricing design, implementation, hopefully alignment, harmonization of various carbon pricing programs. We represent them all over the world, and a lot of that is also in Canada. And I gotta say that on behalf of my Canadian members, it is very, very challenging to see what's really going on in our country on carbon pricing and climate policy, and to see where the puck is headed on this very, very important issue. And that was such a Canadian line. Where's the puck headed? So that's where this panel will help to illuminate the current state of play on climate policy and carbon pricing in the Great White North. I am joined by Amber McNeil at Environment Canada and Climate Change ECCC, and Amber will shed light on the current situation around the national carbon pricing program, also give us a bit of context, though, around the broader pan-Canadian framework. And then we'll go to O'Neill Bergeron from Quebec. And O'Neill is a senior advisor to Cap and Trade Carbon Market up in Quebec. And we're going to have, we like Quebec because it's kind of a beacon of stability amongst the less than stable jurisdictions. And so we're going to hear about what is going on in Quebec and what we expect post-2020 as well in the Quebec carbon market, Cap and Trade, with California. And last but certainly not least, we are going to hear from Brittany White, Nova Scotia, senior advisor there as the new kid on the block to Cap and Trade. So I am going to just get right into things, and Amber is going to start things off with the snapshot of the current national Canadian carbon landscape. Well, also, and you have a map to look at the various provincial situations.
Good
Take
teaser.
it away, Amber.
Everyone loves a map, right? Mm-hmm. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us here today and for having us participate in this panel and the organizers. This is really exciting to get down here in the weeds with everyone and discussing and learning from each other. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So my task is to provide a bit of an overview starting from the federal context before I turn it over to my provincial colleagues. Oh, and I'm going to screw this up. Sorry? Okay, good. Fancy slides. I haven't figured it out quite yet. So to provide a bit of background, Canada's climate plan is the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. It was jointly developed by provinces and territories following extensive engagement with stakeholders and Indigenous communities. And there's a plane taking off behind me, apparently. Can you still hear me if I just power through? Okay. Oh, it's getting louder. Okay. So, the Pan-Canadian Framework. It was released in 2016, and one of the key pillars of that plan, a foundational element, is extending a price on carbon pollution throughout Canada. The plan also, I will talk in quite a bit of detail, or more detail in this panel will as well, on carbon pricing, but I also just want to acknowledge that the plan contains more than 50 other concrete measures related to mitigation, climate resilience, adaptation, clean tech, and innovation investments. So there is many pieces to the roadmap for Canada meeting its Paris commitments. The overall objective, though, of the plan is really to achieve the behavioral and structural changes required for Canada to become a clean economy, a low-carbon economy. So that's the basis and foundation from which we are working. So I will dive into the map, which is, I I find very exciting and colorful, and it really at first blush gives you an idea of the landscape in Canada being pretty diverse. Sorry. Is it my microphone doing it?
I don't know. But
Okay.
hard to ignore it.
Sorry. If I seem distracted, it's because I am. Sorry. But so this is Canada, and this is a snapshot of what carbon pricing looks like today in Canada. So the starting point for the pan-Canadian approach to pricing carbon pollution was an acknowledgement of the robust pricing systems that existed, I'll talk louder, in several provinces already, and my colleague from Quebec is a great shining example of that leadership that already existed. So the pan-Canadian approach was to extend it beyond those existing jurisdictions more broadly so that it existed everywhere in Canada, to a broad set of emissions and with increasing stringency over time. In order to do that, the federal government released the what we call the benchmark, so the set of common criteria. Yeah?
Well done, Lisa.
No, that's great.
Thank you very much.
That's really good.
Lisa Stafford, my colleague, everybody. Yes.
Yay.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. So there is a benchmark, so the criteria that all systems must meet. It's an attempt to balance flexibility, recognizing different circumstances across Canada, but also to ensure fairness across the country and to advance this agenda to have pricing extend throughout the country. And as part of that, the federal government also committed to implement what we call a federal backstop system, so a carbon pricing system in those jurisdictions, provinces or territories that either request it, or in those jurisdictions that don't have a system that meets those benchmark criteria either fully or in part. The federal system would apply. So as of 2019, we're happy to say in Canada that carbon pricing does exist throughout the entire country. It is a mix, as this map shows with the color coding, of existing provincial systems, new provincial and territorial systems, the federal system, as well as a combination in some jurisdictions where there's part federal system and part provincial system. So I think that speaks to Katie's point about it's difficult or challenging to understand all of the dynamics at play, especially if you're a company or a stakeholder or someone who operates in multiple jurisdictions, that is a challenge.
We call it fragmentation nation.
Okay.
But you're working very hard to defragment it.
Yes, we are working very hard. So it is all about balancing that, working towards cohesion and common criteria, but also recognizing that Canada is a big, unique place. The energy mix is different across the country. All these different factors impact how we can get carbon pricing across the finish line in our country. So now speaking just quickly, before I turn it over, I want to talk a little bit about what that federal system, what we call the backstop, is. So legislation was passed by the Canadian Parliament, federal legislation, last spring, and that enables the federal carbon pricing system. And the federal system has two parts. It's modeled after the current system in Alberta, so there's a lot of analogies there if you're familiar with that system. The first component is a regulatory charge on fossil fuels, we call the fuel charge. It's generally payable by fuel distributors and producers that are using or just selling the fuel within a backstop jurisdiction, so a province or territory where the federal system applies. The price starts at $20 per ton in this year, in 2019, and it rises by $10 a ton, ending at $50 in 2022. The second component of the system is the regulatory trading regime for Canada's large industry. It applies to industrial facilities, emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industrial facilities that emit 50 kilotons or more per year, and it also enables voluntary participation, or what we call opt-in, for other EITE or emissions-intensive trade-exposed facilities that want to apply to participate. The main design features is to maintain the carbon price signal, to drive innovation and emissions reductions in Canada's industry, but also balancing international competitiveness concerns and helping to protect against carbon leakage to other jurisdictions that do not have the similar programs or the same type of environmental regulations. Generally, these facilities that are captured by the industrial system, what we call the Output-Based Pricing System, the very fancy governmentese acronym of the OBPS, they generally purchase fuel without the federal fuel charge applying to it, so they have exemption certificates that they show as fuel is delivered to their facility or purchased for their facility, and then instead of complying with that part of the legislation, there's regulatory limits or standards that are sector-based and emissions intensity-based that the facilities need to comply or true up against. Firms or facilities that outperform these sector-based standards can earn surplus credits or credits that they can bank or save for future compliance or sell. So there's always, even if you're performing better than the industrial sector, the carbon price signal is still maintained to drive innovation because there's a financial incentive with the surplus crediting. And then for those facilities that emit above that limit, they have a number of flexible compliance options, and that includes paying the carbon charge, so the $20, $30, $40 or $50 a ton, depending on what year you're in. They can purchase credits from other facilities that outperformed their sector standard. They can purchase eligible offset credits, which will be defined in our regulatory regime, or they can do any mix of those kind of predetermined means of compensating. So in terms of timelines, just to give a bit of an update, so our Prime Minister announced in October of last year where this federal system would apply, and acknowledging the leadership in provinces and territories to either develop their own systems or maintain their systems. So the where happened in October. For the federal system, the system for large industry started on January 1st of this year, and the fuel charge started on April 1st of this year, so we are full steam ahead. Because the compliance period for the industrial system is the calendar year, and obligations and true-up doesn't happen until the following year, our final regulatory package, which includes all of the rules, is still in draft form. We are just wrapping up the consultation period. Drafts were released late last year, and we have a target to finalize those regulations with all of the rules in spring of this year, 2019. So in a very short few weeks coming. But yeah, that's it. And I think another piece, just generally speaking, I know there may be an interest, and we may go there in our conversation or our questions, is the offset piece. It may be of interest. So part of the plan that was announced in our regulatory proposals and our consultations in Canada was that the federal government would recognize specific offsets from provincial systems. So that's one key component, and that will be the details of that, of which projects and which protocols that is to come in the next few months, along with the draft regulations or shortly thereafter. As well, in our federal budget that was just released a few weeks ago now, almost a month ago, there was an announcement to develop and funds associated with developing a federal offset system. So I don't have too much to say, except for the current government has committed to develop that system. We are working very quickly, finalizing the systems regs, but also looking forward to begin and launching that engagement on a federal offset system. But you know, as developing these systems takes time, and that's a process that we're in. So it's very early days, but it is an interesting developing area that we think is really positive for compliance and for the flexibility for the regulatees, as well as, I guess, extending emissions reductions beyond the regulatee community more broadly in the Canadian context. So
I think that was pretty remarkable. I've heard a lot of people explain the current Canadian landscape and the carbon pricing backstop benchmark output-based pricing system, you name it. You did a fantastic job.
Oh,
You were very clear,
thank
very
you.
articulate. I think you hit a lot of the right notes. And I got to say, I know that you are not going on a lot of sleep. You and your team are going very, very, very hard because these are tight, tight timelines, and there's been a lot of work that has been done, but still a lot of work that remains. So let's go over now to the provinces. The two provinces that, again, are beacons of stability amongst some of the chaos. So first, we'll talk, Quebec. You are, again, the old kid on the block. Quebec, you and California. I was going to say something about Ontario, but I'm not going to say anything right now about Ontario. So we'll wait for later. So Quebec. What is going on in Quebec right now? Just a snapshot of the current regulatory landscape, some of the benefits and actual results that you've seen to date in Quebec's cap and trade system, and also sharing some deep thoughts around how you managed, your team, the province managed to weather a storm of an election that went really from one end of the political spectrum to the other with the new party. So O'Neill, take it away and let's hear about where Quebec is right now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about Quebec cap and trade system. So I just have a few slides to give a bit of context, and as Kitty said, I will present the results achieved to date and also next steps. For deep thoughts, I'm not too sure. It was not that much. We can close that question right now. The election in Quebec last October was not that much of a storm because the cap and trade system was never put into questions. So it was basically business as usual. So a bit of context information. The Quebec profile, Quebec has somewhat of a unique profile since the electricity sector basically emits virtually no greenhouse gases because
Sorry, the slide's not advancing. I think you have to point it at the machine on the table in the middle. Right there. Yeah. Oh, it's advancing on the computer. Are you in presentation mode? Bottom right corner?
that's so.
IT problem. So, I was okay. Just going to add some colored commentary while we.
Please do.
I do love how nonchalantly O'Neill did say that. Yeah, we had an election, and yeah,
No big deal.
no big deal. Wasn't an issue. If only every jurisdiction was like Quebec. Because I live in Ontario, and that happened this time last year at NACW on stage. The election hadn't happened yet, and we all knew that climate and carbon pricing and cap and trade was there. It was happening, and that we could see some modification, but we didn't know that it would all fall apart so quickly. Anyway, are you ready, O'Neill?
Yeah, sorry for that hiccup. So I was saying that the electricity sector emits virtually no greenhouse gases, basically because more than 99% of electricity is generated from renewable sources. So the two main sectors that are targeted, if I can say, is the transportation sector and the industrial sector. Agricultural and waste sectors are not directly covered by our cap and trade system, but they are indirectly through fuel distributors. So, so as I was saying, the electricity sector, there's no gain to be seek there. Also, in Quebec, there's a broad support for the fight against climate change and the cap and trade system specifically. So we already have quite ambitious targets that are basically set in stone because it was a decree of council that set those targets for 2020 and 2030. So basically the approach Quebec has is what we call an integrated approach. So there is basically two pillars. The first one would be the cap-and-trade system. The cap-and-trade system has two objectives. The primary objective is to reduce greenhouse gases emissions in the covered sectors, because we have declining caps over the years that basically guarantees emission reduction in the covered sectors. The second objective of the cap-and-trade system is to generate revenues, proceeds, and all those proceeds are sent directly to a green fund, the Fonds Vert, and reinvested in the second pillar of the integrated approach, which is climate change action plan, which contains complementary programs. Most of the money generated by the cap-and-trade system goes for mitigation measures and programs, about 90% of it. There's 8% of that budget that goes to adaptation, and another part for management of the fund. And on top of this integrated approach, there are other policies that do not have climate change as a primary objective, but it's consistent in its approach with the whole integrated climate change approach. So a bit of results to date. So we had two compliance periods behind us, so 2013, 2014, and the second period, 2015 to 2017. In both cases, we had 100% compliance, so all emitters complied with their obligations. Same thing in California, so that's a good sign. We take it as the emitters and stakeholders, they accept the approach and they play along, basically. In terms of numbers, since 2012, the industrial sectors reduced its emission by almost 4%. And in general, we saw lower emission intensity, so they are doing great in that sense. Overall, since 1990, there's basically a decoupling of GHG emission and economic growth. So you have this a reduction in GHG emissions while the gross domestic product and population goes up. So that's a good sign. Also, there was no evidence of carbon leakage, so there was no delocalization of any industry. We also held successful auctions throughout these periods, and now we gained $3 billion in proceeds to these dates, and as I said before, all this money is reinvested in the climate change action plan. Here I want to show examples of complementary measures that were successful. So you see basically a windmill used at Raglan mine up north Quebec. So this mine is far north, so it's not part of the electrical grid. It had to generate its own electricity from diesel generators. And there was financial support from the government to help the company build this windmill that can operate at below 40 degrees Celsius. So it's a great example of something that involvement of the government and goodwill of the company to have emissions reduced. The other great story that we like to showcase is a bus company that built fully electrical buses, and they also launched a couple of weeks back a city truck that is also fully electrical. Again, there was funds provided by the Climate Change Action Plan to help the company innovate and release in the market those electric vehicles. In terms of future work, since I'm sitting beside a Canadian representative, Quebec system is fully recognized as part of the Pan-Canadian framework, and this recognition is important in the long term, so as to provide and maintain this stability of the Quebec cap-and-trade system. We talked about the election last October. Basically, the elected government didn't talk too much about environment during the electoral campaign, but afterwards, this government had to make its own the climate change action. So one way that he will or might do it is that we have a climate change action plan that will end in 2020. So they are working on the next, basically, climate change action plan. One other thing that we are working on, in 2017, we published a reg modification to set allocation rules up until 2023. So we still have to define the allocation rules post-2023. And we will be consulting emitters and stakeholders during the course of this year. It's not mentioned on my slide, but there's also an offset protocol that is ready in its technical version, and we are working hard to have it translate in a legal ways, and to have it up and running, I guess, in the next year or so. We're also continuing our ongoing collaboration and partnerships with California. We are in touch on a daily basis, and also with Nova Scotia, with whom we share technical and administrative services provided by WCI Inc. We also give support and help Oregon, Mexico, and Chile and Transportation and Climate Initiative in in setting up their own system and their own policy. And we also we are still involved in the international organizations such as ICAP, CPSC, IETA. So, thanks.
Thank you. Quick questions. What offset protocols could be coming out?
Sorry, that would be the forest offset protocol that would be applied for private lands.
Mm-hmm. Private lands, not Crown. Yeah, that could be a big one, and many of us would like to see that. Just saying. The other thing, O'Neill, that I think very few people appreciate about the cap-and-trade system and how it's designed in Quebec, it's the revenue use is not just in Quebec, right? There's a segment of the cap-and-trade revenue that you do international spending on. Do you have details? Is there criteria around that?
I know there's a specific program and a specific envelope dedicated to international actions. I don't have the details with me. I don't know the numbers.
I did just put you on the spot, but it is really, but it's very unique, and we would, I think, for again my community, like to see more thought put into how those billions of dollars come in. And of course, they should be spent on home in thoughtful ways, but could also be spent internationally on mitigation activities, but also potentially linked to clean technology export opportunities for that jurisdiction, like in Quebec. All right, so we'll save further discussion until later. Miss Brittany White, Nova Scotia. Bye, Ontario. Hello, Nova Scotia. Okay, so tell us what's really going on in Nova Scotia, where things are at. To link, to not to link, that is the question. Okay,
yes.
no.
So first of all, Katie introduced me as the new kid on the block. We've got a team planning day coming up. I'm going to bring that back to them, see if we can get T-shirts. They're going to love that. Yeah. So my name is Brittany White. I'm from Nova Scotia, and I'm going to give kind of a high-level timeline overview of the program, overview of key elements, talk about some of the challenges that we've come across and how we address them, and then have a little bit of a quick look at next steps. So for timeline, we decided to do cap and trade in response to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. So as Amber mentioned, when the federal government announced, we came out in November 2016 and said we're going to be doing a cap and trade program. So we were the only province that decided to go the cap and trade route after the federal government announced. So we decided to look to WCI for a lot of support. So we joined WCI as a participating jurisdiction in May 2017. And then shortly after, well, not that shortly after, then in February 2018, we released quantification, reporting, and verification regulations. So basically, to set up a cap and trade program, you need to know how much greenhouse gas emissions are happening, and you need to actually track it. So we didn't have that in place yet, so it was a key element for us to put together. So in addition to our QRV regs, government acronyms, gotta love them, we also amended our Environment Act, which enabled the actual creation of our cap and trade program. So then after that, in September 2018, we submitted our details to the federal government to see if it met the benchmark, and we were happy to find out that we passed. So our program launched in January 2019, on January 1st. So it's very new. It's still, it's only 4 months old now. And so one of the key things that we did at the outset of the program, as O'Neill mentioned, we're with WCI, and we use the same online program. It's called KITS. And so we started registering people in March. So that was kind of the first step that we've actually done. And then in April, we distributed some of our first allowances as well. So the program's still early days, but we've done some important things so far. In addition to the cap and trade program, what we came out with was our new 2030 goal. So for Nova Scotia, we have a range. It's 45 to 50% below our 2005 emission levels. And where we're currently at, right now we're at 31% below 2005. So we met the federal goal, which is 30%. We met it about 14 or so years early, so we're pretty happy about that. We were ahead of schedule on that one. So now the nitty-gritty details of our program. What does it actually look like? So our caps in our program are, when I say them out loud, they're going to sound so tiny in comparison to California and Quebec, so please don't laugh. So our caps for 2019 are 13.68, and then they're gradually going down. So by 2022, we're going to be at 12.14. So they are a little bit smaller, but we are still going to have significant action throughout that program. Basically what that means is our first compliance period is 2019 to 2022, and we're going to be reducing emissions by 650,000 tons. And that's in addition to other program action. So cap and trade is one element. Like O'Neill was mentioning, Quebec, most jurisdictions do more than one thing. So in other areas we're focusing on include renewable energy, energy efficiency, and transportation. And from those programs, we're getting another 1.4 million tons reductions. So who's actually in our cap and trade program? It currently covers about 80% of the emissions in the province. Anyone who emits, so facilities that emit above 50,000 tons are going to be covered. This includes the electricity sector. Petroleum product suppliers that bring in 200 liters or more for sale and consumption in Nova Scotia are also included. Natural gas distributors that when gas is burned, over 10,000 tons are also in. So a number of sectors are also excluded for us. So for example, aviation fuel, agriculture, solid waste, things like that. Our regulations are very, very similar to Quebec, formerly Ontario, and California. Very similar. So That's kind of a really, really high-level description of our program. I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've come across, especially because other jurisdictions might be looking to kind of get things developed. Like obviously, Mexico is in mode, Oregon. So hopefully share some wisdom of things to not do. So the first thing, we were working under a very, very tight timeline. When we were looking to other jurisdictions, they had a longer period that they developed their programs under. It was pretty tight. So we announced in 2016, and we had it up and running by January 2019. So how did we actually meet this? In all honesty, we called Quebec and California and Ontario a lot. They were incredibly supportive. We asked them a lot of questions. We had many helpful discussions, and it was very, very helpful. Another key thing was that we did mirror our program off of these, so a lot of the work was already done, so it made it a little bit easier. So for jurisdictions that are considering it, look to others to see what has worked and borrow it, and maybe ask what didn't work and what was changed. Regulations are constantly amended. If you can look to see what's updated, look to see and why they changed it. Another thing that is unique about our program is that we're very tiny. So we have approximately 25 participants in our program, and we are not currently linked with WCI. So although we are a participating jurisdiction, we don't actually trade with them. So we are, our legislation enables it. So we are able to link down the road, and that's part of the reason that we have modeled our program off of it, but we haven't decided to do that at this time. The other thing I wanted to mention about market liquidity is that we also did enable offsets as well. So when we're looking at our small market, a lot of people will immediately ask, when are you linking? When are you doing offsets? We understand that these are important elements of a cap and trade program, and we're looking at them, and they'll talk about offsets and next steps. So those are, two high-level lessons that we really learned was, when you're working under a tight timeline, or even if you have more time, reach out and make connections with other jurisdictions and ask them questions. But also, consider your own elements, like the fact that we have a small market. Think about what that means and how you can mitigate it. So for next steps, we're looking at developing administrative penalties. So far, people have been compliant. They haven't had to do much except register, but we do need to have regulations in place for issues of noncompliance. The next thing we're going to be doing as well is developing a green fund. Like cap and trade programs, we're bringing in revenue, so we need to decide how that money is going to be spent. That's currently outlined in our legislation at a really, really high level. It basically says we can spend it on climate change and clean tech. So it's pretty broad. So we're actually going to be developing the program on the specifics of how it will actually be spent. And obviously another big question, offsets. We are currently looking into which protocols to use, how to approach it. Will we be looking to develop the protocols and then have projects come forward, or will we have projects come forward and then develop the protocols? There's different techniques on how to do that. And a last question we get a lot is, when are you auctioning? Our first auction will be scheduled in 2020. Under our regulation, we have between a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 4 auctions per year. So starting in 2020. So for the first year, companies won't actually be doing a lot of activity. They're basically registering in the program and reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's pretty much it for the new kid on the block. If you've got specific questions on our cap and trade program, happy to chat either now or after.
That's a great rundown. Thanks very much, Brittany. So a few quick questions for, all of you. But Nova Scotia, so you're 50,000 tons or more?
Yes.
Okay. And 50,000 tons, voluntary opt-in. So how is the response so far? How has it been? Do you want us to just provide a few more details on the voluntary opt-in process and who's allowed and what the response has been to date in terms of,
Yeah, so under the federal system, so only in those jurisdictions where the federal system applies, there are, by policy, there's details about who can apply. So it's targeted at emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries that are not currently captured in that 50 kilotons and above. We put a minimum threshold of 10 kilotons. So it's kind of that 10 to 50 and above, and that are emissions intensive, trade exposed. So we have a list of sectors from which can apply and have been applying. It's been extended to the mush sector and others, but also we have just recently in March kind of expanded based on pretty extensive stakeholder feedback about the burden on the smaller industrial players of being completely underpaying the fuel charge. So if you're not under our industrial system, you pay 100% of your emissions, or combustion emissions, I guess I should say, sorry, under the fuel charge. So we heard that burden and that there were real competitiveness risks and carbon leakage risks associated with that. So we've kind of adjusted tack, and we've developed a process whereby if you do not exist in a sector that is defined already, like if you're not lime, steel, cement, the sectors within Canada that we have large players that are well known to the department, then you can apply, and there's certain criteria, and we do an assessment to ensure that it is you are at competitiveness risk, and then you will be, quote, designated by the minister as a participant, and then so there's a process to get into the system, but once you're in the system, all the same rules apply to you there. So that has really opened the scope. So we have, just to give a sense of scale, within the backstop, we have just over 120 mandatory facilities, so those large facilities over 50 kilotons, and we are seeing significant uptake of opt-in. We don't fully know because opt-ins can apply at any time. There's no regulatory or registration deadline. So we have, I think the latest numbers, don't quote me, but I can follow up with my registration colleagues, but I think we had more than 40 applicants in the queue and fairly processed before the fuel charge took effect on April 1st, so fairly recently, because that was the driver. You want to minimize the time when you're paying fully the fuel charge. But we do expect, the policy was only released formally in March, so we expect, we're doing a lot of outreach and webinars and those types of things, because as this is a new system, this is new for Canada, this is new for these jurisdictions, so we think as people, these facilities start to realize and start to feel the impacts, it's a diplomatic way to see.
Feel the burn. No, yeah.
Thank you, Katie. Then we think that there will be more uptake to that voluntary program as well.
Yeah. It's the consultations, I mean, it's intense. Webinars, it's for you guys, but also for, business and industry that are having to, track it all. They call it, I think, a bit of consultation fatigue, but it's very, very important. Is there any voluntary?
Yeah, so that's a good point to add. So Nova Scotia doesn't have any voluntary participants, and we also don't have general market participants, so we don't have observers. So basically, if you're not a mandatory participant, then you're not in the cap and trade program right now.
And when you talk about the world of complementary or not complementary mechanisms, do you want to, because you're obviously going through, this is broad, the Pan-Canadian framework, as you said, has numerous pieces and measures, and one of the other bigger ones, obviously carbon pricing, big, important, prioritized, but the CFS, can you provide the clean fuel standards, some of the latest on that? And then I'd also be curious just with anything on the CFS front in Quebec, Nova Scotia, reactions to what's happening nationally on that.
Yeah, sure. So the clean fuel standard in Canada, modeled after what exists in the U.S., is another key mitigation component targeting emissions reductions to accelerate emissions reductions within the transportation sector, which is a huge source of emissions federally, or within Canada, for the country. It is currently still in an earlier stage of regulatory development. So whereas the carbon pricing piece was first out the door, very aggressive timeline, the Clean Fuel Standard is still under an aggressive timeline, but it hasn't started implementation yet, so it's a little ways away. They have released kind of a draft framework, consulted on that, expecting the first look at draft type regulations in the coming months, and then something I may get asked this question, but something we hear a lot in the Canadian context from our stakeholders from the regulatee community is, I think I heard a stakeholder the other day talk to me about the pancaking effect of different regulatory regimes where our attempt is to drive this aggressive path or roadmap to meeting our Paris objectives, but also recognizing that as we are advancing these things, it's hitting a lot of the same players with multiple levels of regulation. So we are working on with our stakeholders through the engagement fatigue, hopefully not too badly, but to try and address that. So it's carbon pricing is the first thing implemented in this scale, and then the Clean Fuel Standard will follow after.
Thank you. Who's heard of that, the pancake effect? The Canadians.
Are you
yeah.
Canadian? Yeah.
So you heard it here first, all right? Homegrown Canadian, the pancake effect. It's going to go global.
Yeah.
Watch. Okay. So, any reactions, CFS?
Anything to add with a maple syrup joke there?
Okay.
You just gotta go for it. Okay, so for CFS, so we're working with the feds and we're keeping an eye on the Clean Fuel Standard as part of our climate change team. But I just kind of wanted to back up and put a little bit of context on emissions in Nova Scotia and what that looks like and our role in the transportation sector. So for us, transportation makes up about 32% of our greenhouse gas emissions, whereas electricity is much, much higher. It's 42% of our emissions, and that's primarily because we still rely on coal for some of our electricity. So CFS is important, but another key thing for us, as we have conversations to move towards electric vehicles, we need to clean up our electricity source first, or as a part of that. So Nova Scotia is focused on building EV infrastructure across the province, with the goal to be able to drive on across the entire province and have infrastructure so you can actually travel across the entire jurisdiction. But one key element of that will be moving towards renewable energy. So right now we have a goal by 2020 to be 40% renewable, and we're at about 27-28% of our electricity is currently from renewable resources. So it's kind of in CFS is important, but it's also looking at other ways that we can reduce emissions in the transportation sector too.
That was really helpful. Thanks, Brittany.
From Quebec's perspective, as we saw during my presentation, transportation is the key sector where we have to draw down the emissions. So we welcome any initiative that can help us on that front. The CFS would be part of that, so we're following this work and also participating in any consultation. Also, I just want to add to the previous point about opt-in emitters. I didn't mention that, but that's a new feature in the Quebec cap and trade system starting this year, the January 1st of 2019. So they had to register last fall. So we know now that there's about a dozen corporations that registers as voluntary emitters, voluntary participants, or opt-in emitters, should I say. And they represent about twice as much facilities. So the number of emitters grew in the last couple of months.
Thank you for adding that. We were happy to see that. Thank you. Well done, Quebec. Yeah. So are there any questions? Audience? Yes. Thank you for addressing the elephant in the room.
Do you want me to start?
Amber, all yours.
Okay, so I would be interested to hear as well from my provincial colleagues on this point, and I think this is obviously a hot topic right now. It is ever present in our conversations back at the office as well. I would say from the federal perspective, you asked about what has our learning been and how our thinking has evolved. So from the outset of the system, so starting in 2016, I spoke briefly about how the provinces and territories were given the flexibility to maintain or establish systems, and then also there was the commitment for the federal backstop component. And from the beginning, the backstop system was designed so that it could apply anywhere in Canada, recognizing that things could evolve as circumstances change, as there's elections or more people develop their own system or whatever that may be. A bit of context for the broader room, some of you probably are aware. So there is an annual review process so there was the initial, what we call benchmarking, so assessing provincial and territorial systems against the common criteria that systems must meet, and people passed, or the federal government decided to implement the federal system. So that was at the outset, and that process will continue annually, but also the government has said that they will monitor any changes that happen as they come, and we saw that in Ontario last year. And I think in terms of learning, that was a key element in the design of choosing, because I think at the very beginning, from the federal government perspective, you could go two ways. You could do the backstop nature where provinces and territories take the first step, and then the federal government fills in the gaps, but you could also go the other way where use somewhat like equivalency agreement type thing where the federal government applies first and then provinces can get out of the federal system. But we chose that backstop path. From a working level, we were focused on the, quote, likely jurisdictions developing the system, but always with that eye that things could change. And we kind of saw that with Ontario, and we learned a lot through that experience about trying to step beyond the politics and make sure that our engagement with stakeholders was very broad, with companies and facilities across Canada, that everybody has a stake in how the system was designed, and that has proven very, very useful. I think that when we're talking about challenges, I think that also is a huge challenge that we as Canadians, and with the patchwork map that we showed you, that we are struggling with or we are trying to work towards, is also within that dynamic creating some sort of regulatory certainty with an eye to, because the whole purpose of having carbon pricing is to incent these long-term changes and investments, and year to year or election cycle to election cycle, that's very difficult to meet anyone's objectives. I know that's stating the obvious, I apologize, but so that is a key challenge that we are dealing with, that we are working with our provincial and territory colleagues. We still, as the federal government, are very committed and believe that this is, the most efficient, effective way to reduce emissions, but also recognize that along with other measures to get us there, I think it is something that has been very political, and we could all do a better job within the government in terms of our public communications and garnering buy-in. I think a lot of the focus was on getting the systems in place, getting out the door, doing all the legislative, regulatory work. Like, this was a very large agenda for us to be taking on. But I think as we move forward, the investment of having just a common understanding of why carbon pricing works, why does it still work when you return revenues back, how do these investments, what are the costs of inaction, and for Canada as a country, we're a relatively small country, but we could be very well positioned to take advantage of the economic opportunities that come with this global transition, and being an early mover in that space and driving that, as opposed to being a receiver of the costs. later on. Anyway, that's kind of a long, rambly spout
I think
and
you
non-answer.
did a fantastic job. I
as
think
well.
you did a fantastic job.
Thank you. So those are my thoughts.
Tough question. Yes, go for it.
So I can't comment on the federal election, but from our view, right, our first compliance period goes out until 2022. And, we've invested in the program, we've passed the regulations, we've done the legislation, we've worked really closely with our stakeholders who really just want certainty. At the end of the day, a lot of our businesses and companies, they just want to know what's coming so they can plan for it. We haven't heard anything to the contrary, so following the federal election, Nova Scotia will continue on with its cap and trade program, especially since we're set up to 2022.
When is your election?
I think it's 2 years from now. We've got a little bit of time. We had one in 2016, I believe.
So, just for, and Neil, do you want to say something about it too?
Sure.
Okay, I was just going to say for context, I don't think people appreciate some of them, like how many elections we've had in the last, it wasn't just Ontario, right? We had Ontario, New Brunswick, we just had PEI this week.
Alberta.
Went conservative, Alberta, and then Alberta was 2 weeks ago, right? A lot of elections, and the federal election is in October, likely, right, this fall. So, but at least once we get over the next round of elections, we'll have a bit of stability for a little while. So, sorry, go.
So Quebec has been engaged in the fight against climate change since 2006, where it published its first climate change action plan. The next year, it was one of the first jurisdictions in North America to put a price on carbon with a fossil fuel levy, which was then replaced by the cap and trade system. Our cap and trade system has been enforced since 2013, linked with California in 2014. Our system is stable, is thriving, so when you talk about survival, that's not even in our vocabulary. We're not surviving, we're thriving. So we want to welcome more partners. So whether, I can't comment, I guess, on the federal election either, but whatever happens at the federal level, the cap and trade system in Quebec was enforced prior to the Canada system and will still be there afterwards. So it's a non-question for us. And regarding stability, I think we have proven that the carbon market in the California-Quebec carbon market is fairly pretty stable with the Ontario episode. So we showed that we can welcome another partner in our linked market. We proved that, and we proved that we can also manage delinking on a short notice.
Yeah.
So we dealt with that situation in a way to make sure that the market was still stable, so the transactions were not permitted the same day that there was an announcement in Ontario regarding their delinking. So as far as Quebec is concerned, cap and trade the system is there to stay. And as I said before, even though there will be other provincial election in Quebec, as the last one showed, there's a broad support in Quebec for the cap and trade system, so it's there to stay.
I'm glad you brought that up, the lesson learned from the Ontario link and then the D-link, right? And that you did preserve the program, you in California. And there's more confidence there than ever, despite Ontario.
And one other point that I want to add is, for us, one key message that we want to send to our stakeholders is that we need this stability message, because if we want stakeholders or emitters to make a significant investment, so they have to have a clear view in the long term, and that's what we want to provide them with.
And that just supports what you were saying, Amber, about that. Are there any final questions in the room? Yes, sir. That's a way to wrap it up.
Yeah. And I will now take you right through your lunch.
You know what? John Hutchison, everybody, former Ministry of Environment at, sorry, but now you're not anymore, so you can say whatever you want.
I think I'm still bound by my oath of confidence. However, the Ontario voter is not going to listen to what Quebec has to say about how wonderful carbon pricing is. The challenge of the federal government is to counteract the message being received by Ontarians from the current provincial government. And that is a difficult message to overcome because, well, I don't want to go too far in it because I'll end up using an expletive. But when you're up against, well, look at how successful Trump is with his lie. So when the provincial government states that cap and trade will kill jobs, and I'm saving you 4.5 cents on your liter of gasoline, how do you compete with that?
And I call cap and trade a carbon tax. Cap and trade carbon tax, cap and trade carbon tax, tax. That's what people hear.
Yeah.
So
Spin.
it's a very different.
And it was nascent. It was nascent, John. Ontario was still, that's the thing, the maturity of Quebec, right? Maturity of your program. You actually had legitimate results, right, that you can then showcase. There's the empirical evidence. This is how it's actually benefiting you, consumer, business, innovation, competitiveness, clean tech, growth. So, I mean, it was still relatively nascent. I agree, though, there was a communications failure.
I think, I work in the industry, so by the time the election came, there were people in EV cars that were saving lots of money
Yep.
every year. There were lots of old residential buildings that were retrofitted that were saving 25, 30% of their utility costs
I know.
every year. So there were messages to give. There was a lot of communication that was available, and I think
Agreed.
it counteracts a lot of what we were hearing from the other side right now. Listen, we're all on the same team, but I'm just saying that there is work and messaging that can be given right now. I don't think we lay down and let them lie and just say, okay, well, it's a difficult thing to fight. I think there are a lot of messages there that people understand.
And I couldn't agree more. It's a communications piece and a lot of lessons learned coming out of Ontario. And so, sorry, how is the federal government taking some of that on and trying to communicate it so it sticks and people are really aware of the potential benefits of supporting this as you certainly weather a few storms?
Yeah, so absolutely.
And I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, sorry. So I'll try and speak very, very quickly, but I think, just echoing what we've heard, I don't think that we in this community can underestimate the challenge ahead with combating what has proven to be a fairly simplistic, negative message that has gotten out there and a story that has been told. So that narrative has legs and it is ingrained. So we have definitely an uphill battle which we recognize, and we are trying, have tried, and need to do better on that front. And I think that you touched on a really good point in your initial asking of the question was maybe the federal government isn't the best storyteller in that, the most effective piece. We definitely have a responsibility to Canadians, to industry, to ourselves to do a better job with that story. But I think it's also recognizing that we're regulators, we are a government, we come with a whole context, and that story, that narrative can be told very well in highlighting examples in the business and private sector, in our provincial colleagues that have had systems for more than a decade and have shown that emissions go down at the same time as their economies have grown, and that is the case in BC and Quebec, and the 3 jurisdictions in Canada that had pricing systems in place also led in economic growth and jobs creation in 2017. Those are stats that we have. And I think from the federal government saying that, we will say it, we will continue to say it, but we also need that echoed elsewhere, and we are have started to work through the CPLC and other venues to leverage other jurisdictions as well as the private sector voice in that piece. But I think it's also a piece about, we've touched a bit about it, but it's not just about pricing, it's also about the use of proceeds and the reinvestment in that and the economic opportunities. And this is about creating good, stable jobs for an economy that is going to continue and thrive. And it is a difficult story to tell, but I think that those are kind of key elements to reinforcing it. And it will be very political, and it will be a big challenge, but something that we are very focused on.
So I think that's really important, although in spirit of full disclosure, before we got into the room, I said, are there things that are no-go zones? I was like, what about the legal court cases? Very important, though, but you can just generally address the process where things stand, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So obviously I don't have, as an official representing the Government of Canada, I don't have too much to say on that, but for those that in the room that are not aware, on the Government of Ontario and the Government of Saskatchewan kind of led in filing actions with their provincial courts of appeal, questioning the constitutional ability of the federal government to impose the backstop system in which we discuss. So in Canada, the federal provincial kind of division of powers, that this is a new area. This is a new program. So obviously in designing the federal system, we consulted our lawyers and we worked with the Department of Justice, and we're confident in our constitutional ability to implement the system. There is definitely disagreement, and we've seen that. So the initial hearings that involved both provincial and federal governments, as well as experts or testimonials from other organizations on both sides, have happened in Saskatchewan and in Ontario. We know that New Brunswick and Manitoba are also supporting their provincial colleagues in Ontario and Quebec in that challenge against the federal government. We haven't heard the outcome of the Court of Appeal, the Provincial Courts of Appeals positions on that, and we're just waiting for the outcome. So I know that's a process answer to a much bigger question, but that's all I can really say.
Again, I should give you a promotion. I'm okay, Larry. We have to wrap up. To be fair, we did start about 10 minutes late, so I'm not that bad a moderator, and we did get a few heavy-hitting questions towards the end. I just want to do a mention with the court case, over coffee or drinks, or at some point, if you want to learn more, approach one of them or me. IETA is the official only business intervener in both cases. Manitoba filed yesterday, and Alberta, with the new election, we expect them to file by the end of this month. It's a big deal. It's happening in real time up there. But don't be scared to come visit us up in Canada.
Of course.
So a warm round of applause for my panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. And we're here for the conference, so feel free, all of us, to
Absolutely.
approach.
We won't bite.